Hello and welcome to Vulgar. I am speaking this at the height of the Columbia/New York protests. They're spreading at schools throughout the United States, mostly elite private schools, but you'll see them at public schools as well. I've been thinking a lot about my traditional stance towards protesting, which is that more or less it doesn't work for what it says it's going to do. That is, actually give a voice to the voiceless, because if they were truly voiceless, they would not be able to protest, and affect policy change through putting pressure on political and governmental and elite figures. I've actually always pointed out that protest success is mostly in solidarity around the cause, but that is an internal to the left issue. But over time, I've nuanced myself on this position, and it led me to think about the nature of protesting, both the inherent problems on it. Protesting is an act of dependency, believe it or not. I know it seems like an act of will because of the action, because of doing something, which is always a problem on the left. People want to feel like they are doing something immediate for immediate change, but most of the things they do for immediate change cannot bring about immediate change. Asking the powers that be to give you something that you can't make them give you is an act of dependency. But nonetheless, that's not the only thing I'm here to say today, because protest internal nature, as they solidify, they make people feel seen, they can recognize each other in opposition to a specific event or thing, actually is important to pivoting to something else. Protest and riots and strikes, the three kinds of left-wing insubordinate action that aren't just basically terrorism, are ways where aggregates of people can become polyglot collective agencies, meaning they're speaking many voices around one thing. And that's one thing they all agree upon. But this could also miss out on the rest of what a politics, properly speaking, is, or even an anti-politics. We must ask ourselves today, what happens after the strike, after the riot, and after the protests? We have seen more riots and protests worldwide in the last 10 years than in any other recorded period in human history. And yet, most of the things protested and rioted about did not change anything. We can talk about the yellow vest in France, or the workers' protest in France against Macron. None of those, properly speaking, met their own stated objectives. When you go to America, the history is even more bleak. The Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong irregulars had a lot more to say about Nixon finally ending Vietnam than any event like Kent State. Yet Kent State solidified the identity of both the New Left and the New Communist movement. So this is why, while I think protesting is a habitus of the middle 20th century, it is a habit that we have inculcated as a culture on the left. It's not one that we should go around yelling and shouting down. We definitely should not be siding with liberals pretending these protests are anti-Semitic pogroms, or that they were particularly violent. If anything, these were nonviolent protests at elite universities with fairly elite students of a mixed character, many of whom are holding student visas, and those are not domestic, properly speaking, and who are vulnerable. Furthermore, the overproduction of elite schools and elite students actually means that a lot of these people will fall into areas of lower classes because we overproduce them. And so whatever maximalist rhetoric particular leaders say on this should be taken as part of the frustration and heteroglot speech of a nascent movement that is, broadly speaking, in the U.S. popular, but cannot seem to turn itself into a peace movement generally, even less a general pivot towards something like radical change. But this requires us to look hard at the protests of the last 10 years, which we're probably not willing to do. The BLM insurrections were more than protests. They were protests come riots. They were truly insurrectionary, and they pivoted to dual power mechanisms, etc. But what they ended up being liquidated and recuperated into is well known. DEI programs at universities and major corporations, which are currently being gutted. A whole industry around HR training. And multiple organizations, quite a few of whom the right wing has rightly condemned as being money grifts, of which there was no accountability. Furthermore, our story about Me Too is often missed. Me Too actually began as much around the issues of Fox News and female reporters at Fox News as it did around Weinstein. And it spread precipitously through social media. In some ways, it was concurrent with the anti-Trump women's marches, but in no way did it become a coherent political movement. And the Democrats themselves, after the situation with Al Franken, seemed to be dead set on making sure that it didn't go after their own, like Governor Cuomo. Nonetheless, here we are. So we have to ask ourselves today, why do elites care about crushing these private elite school peaceful protests around Palestine? Indeed, even the most maximalist program around this is more deliverable than some of the maximalist programs offered by BLM, which involved abolishing the police immediately, reparations that would be incredibly unpopular, etc. But those demands in BLM, particularly on its second round, were interesting. And both times BLM started in the industrial Midwestern heartland, the place where the poorest people are in cities. And they ended in round one during the Obama administration on university campuses, speaking university campuses and calling for things like the diversification of the FBI, or in round two, corporate DEI programs and conservatives learning their hatred for CRT. And then liberals defending critical race theory as if it was mere anti-racism, which it was most definitely not. But this all seems like the distant past, and today we have Palestine. So the question becomes not, should we condemn these protesters? The answer is obviously no. Should we support them? To some degree, yes. Although with the caveat that right now, this is still a fairly elite movement that has general public sentiment on its side. Even amongst conservatives, there has been noticed how vociferously these are being tased and crushed, while conservatives also pretend that no such police actions were taken against Black Lives Matter. We can get back to the pernicious reason that may be, but there is a truth here that we have to deal with. Why is it that Democratic policymakers were willing to support what amounted to a riot amongst truly disenfranchised people, and then to turn on it when it's an interelite problem today? That is not because of the benevolence of the Democrats. Do not ever fool yourself on this. Part of the motivations were cynically electoral. We have to admit that to ourselves. It does matter how the media covers a protest movement, depending on whether or not there is a Republican or Democratic administration, and it doesn't take any idiot to go through the past and see it. And it also does not help that in the machinations of trying to adopt a Smithian friend-enemy calculus, a lot of these leftists have mistaken their cultural influence with actual sovereign power and think that they can pivot for and against free speech on a moment's notice without seeming incoherent to the rest of society. Today we are back when the left needs free speech again, so ostensibly it is for it. We have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do after these protests get cleared, which they inevitably will? We have to hope that people like Tom Cotton don't get their wish to state these protesters. They might. We're already seeing tasers and batons out on the regular. Not that this is new. Go back to Occupy, go back to BLM. There's always people getting tased and pepper sprayed on college campuses during protests. It's part of the nature of the beast. And we can also see how the right is going to pick up a lot of this language. I almost promise you in the next 1 to 2 years, you're going to see right-wingers calling foreign students and immigrants at the border settlers, adopting left-wing parlance. The irony of Jay Sakai talk is not lost on anyone. But no, we should not be supporting anyone suppressing these protests. Their aims are noble. They actually have clear demands. And while, yes, there are occasional voices that emerge that say things that are maximalist to an absurd degree, or sometimes even anti-Semitic, we should not deny that this sometimes happens. We should expect it to happen given the frustration. After all, 1.5% of the Gazan population is already dead, and up to 30% of it is starving. I can imagine a lot of otherwise irrational anger coming from that. We must remember that the less fetish for mass politics that it has off of the period just between World War I and World War II and right after the Fordist Compromise is based on the trauma of war. So we have been wrongly assuming that that was a normal state of affairs. But the case of the Palestinians, they are definitely in the midst of the trauma of war, and thus most things we do to support them should be, at least tacitly, seen as a good, at least in ending the current situation. But we cannot leave it with this being good enough. After all, the U.S. left cannot actually end a war in Israel. We hope that if the U.S. was stopping funding it, and we hope that if BDS took off, that it would end the war. But we don't know that. The analogies of South Africa are fraud. South Africa's economy was not mainly in military software, nor has anyone going to be able to get Israel to denuclearize the way people were able to get South Africa to denuclearize, largely actually from the pressure of a conservative administration that did not even formally recognize that apartheid was going on. Just as many protesters think they've learned the lesson of South Africa, so too have many in the Israeli government. Do not fool yourself on this. But it is not hopeless, either in the case of the situation in Gaza, nor in the case of the larger left. It's going to depend on what we use these moments for, who expands into them, and how they do it. So yes, we should definitely support the protest, even if we know that in and of themselves, protesting does not, quote, work. It is not, quote, a fool politics. If we look at the history of protesting the king, which is where the concept comes from, was an act of bypassing your immediate dominators, usually local lords. But you were also proving that you could have a peasant insurrection. The protest was an appeal to the king for the king to step in and do his job as mitigator of lordly power, but also with the threat of violence in the background. The irony of the logic of nonviolent protesting is that it has always been dependent on either counter-violence from opposition, making it look noble, and that was even true in the case of the civil rights era and of Gandhi, or the fact that if the peaceful protesters lose, there's a more radical, more willing to do violence set of cadres in the background. For liberals to understand this, you can think of the dichotomy, tension, and even friendship as expressed by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. The two were both oppositional to each other, but also in many ways utterly dependent on each other. So what are you going to do with this? The current left seems to be stalling. The union movement has grown and that support for unions have gone up dramatically, but it has not grown and that union density has not increased at all, and in fact has stagnated. Left-wing cultural sentiments are more prominent amongst young people now than they've ever have been, even after the new left. And yet, there seems to be no viable left-wing politics that even can handle these cultural sentiments, much less any political economic ones. Why is that? What do we pivot to now? And how do you learn from the past? Because if you don't learn from the past cycles of these protests, you are going to repeat them. And you will make Danny Besner's critique that protesting are an outdated technology that elites can ignore true. But my question to Danny is, if that were really true, and this has also been a question to myself, why is it that on this round, the need to suppress these protests that have clear aims that are even bipartisan, are possible even under the current regime, and are coming from elites themselves in the standpoint of their children, then why is it that this is being suppressed so hard? And the answer is maybe not the protest, but what happens on the moments after. And that's where the important work will be done. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. I don't like doing ads on anything that touches on Palestine, so we'll just leave it at that. Protect your peace.